The point I'm trying to make is we care about the oceans. Our hearts are breaking for what's happening in the oceans. We've got to do something about it. And we're always talking about what are the action items when we make a documentary. You know, what are we asking people to do? What are the changes they can make in their daily life? Well, I'm going to tell you one. I watched that film, Forks Over Knives. I went into the kitchen. I took everything out of the kitchen that was not a plant. It's amazing. But setting aside the health benefits, how often do you get that kind of incredible win-win where you can really transform the planet? And it's possible. You got to check the facts for yourselves. You're not going to believe it hearing it from me. But I want to challenge everybody here. If you're an environmentalist, I say, my challenge is you can't be an environmentalist. You can't be an ocean steward without truly walking the walk. And you can't walk the walk in the world of the future, the world ahead of us, the world of our children, not eating a plant-based diet. That's my challenge. You can check the facts for yourselves. And anyway, so.
Without using any gas or oil or fuel ever again from this day forward, we would still exceed our maximum carbon equivalent greenhouse gas emissions, the 565 gigatons, by the year 2030, without the electricity sector even, or energy sector even factored in the equation, all simply by raising and eating livestock.
If you reduce the amount of methane emissions, the level in the atmosphere goes down fairly quickly and within decades, as opposed to CO2. If you reduce the emissions to the atmosphere, you don't really see a signal in the atmosphere for 100 years or so.
The single largest contributor to every known environmental ill known to humankind: deforestation, land use, water scarcity, the destabilization of communities, world hunger. The list doesn't stop. The leading cause of environmental destruction is animal agriculture.
In 1812, there were 1 billion people on the planet. In 1912, there were 1.5 billion. Then, just 100 years later, our population exploded to 7 billion humans. This number is rightly given a great deal of attention, but an even more important figure when determining world population is the world's 70 billion farm animals humans raise. The human population drinks 5.2 billion gallons of water every day and eats 21 billion pounds of food. But just the world's 1.5 billion cows alone drink 45 billion gallons of water every day and eat 135 billion pounds of food. This isn't so much a human population issue, it's a human eating animals population issue.
We're growing enough food right now in the world to feed between 12 and 15 billion people. We only have 7 billion people. We have roughly 1 billion people starving every single day. Worldwide, 50% of the grain and legumes that we're growing, we're feeding to animals. So they're eating huge amounts of grain and legumes. And in the United States, it's more like closer to 70, 80, depending on which grain it is, about 90% of the soybeans.
82% of the world's starving children live in countries where food is fed to animals in the livestock systems that are then killed and eaten by more well-off individuals in developed countries such as the US, UK, and in Europe.
Raising cattle produces more greenhouse gases than all cars, trucks, trains, boats, planes combined. 13% compared to 18% for livestock. This is because cows produce a substantial amount of methane from their digestive process. Methane gas from livestock is 25 to 100 times more destructive than carbon dioxide from vehicles. Hydraulic fracturing for natural gas uses an incredible amount of water. A staggering 100 billion gallons of water is used every year in the United States. But when I compare this with animal agriculture, raising livestock just in the US consumes 34 trillion gallons of water. And it turns out the methane emissions from both industries are nearly equal.
The average Californian uses about 1,500 gallons per person per day. About half of that is related to the consumption of meat and dairy products. So meat and dairy products are incredibly water intensive, in part because the animals are using very water intensive grains. That's what they eat. And so all of the water embedded in the grain and that the animal eats essentially is considered part of the virtual water footprint of that product.
I found out that 1/4 pound hamburger requires over 660 gallons of water to produce. Here I've been taking these short showers trying to save water, and to find out just eating one hamburger is the equivalent of showering 2 entire months. So much attention is given to lowering our home water use, yet domestic water use is only 5% of what is consumed in the US versus 55% for animal agriculture. That's because it takes upwards of 2,500 gallons of water to produce 1 pound of beef. When I added up all the government's recommendations, I was saving 47 gallons a day. But still, that's not even close to the 660 gallons of water for just one burger. I started doing more investigating on the impacts of livestock and found out the situation was actually worse than I had thought. In 2009, 2 advisors from the World Bank released an analysis on human-induced greenhouse gases, finding that animal agriculture was responsible not for 18%, as the UN stated, but was actually 51% of all greenhouse gases. 51%. Yet all we hear about is burning fossil fuels. This devastating figure is due to clear-cutting rainforests for grazing, respiration, and all the waste animals produce. This makes animal agriculture the #1 contributor to human-caused climate change. 116,000 pounds of farm animal excrement is produced every second in the United States alone.
Livestock operations on land has caused created more than 500 nitrogen-flooded dead zones around the world in our oceans, comprise more than 95,000 square miles of areas completely devoid of life. So any meaningful discussion about the state of our oceans has to always begin by frank discussions about land-based animal agriculture.
Methane production from cows and other livestock's flatulence is a major contributor, but mostly it is due to deforestation and the waste they produce, which is 130 times more waste than the entire human population, virtually all without the benefit of any waste treatment. The UN reported that 3/4 of the world's fisheries are overexploited, fully exploited, or significantly depleted due to overfishing.
The oceans are under siege like never before, and marine environments are in trouble. And if we don't wake up and do something about it, we're going to see fishless oceans by the year 2048. That's the prediction from scientists.
The way fishing is done today to feed the demand for 90 million tons of fish is primarily through massive fish nets. For every single pound of fish caught, there's up to 5 pounds of untargeted species trapped, such as dolphins, whales, sea turtles, and sharks, known as bykill. An acre of rainforest is cleared every second, and the leading cause is to graze animals and grow their feed crops. That is essentially an entire football field cleared every single second. And it is estimated that every day, close to 100 plant, animal, and insect species are lost due to rainforest destruction. It is estimated that palm oil is responsible for 26 million acres being cleared, though, compared to livestock and their feed crops, they were responsible for 136 million acres of rainforest lost to date.
No matter how many of these operations I was doing for women for breast cancer, I wasn't doing one single thing for the next unsuspecting victim.
So Dr. Esselstyn started investigating the global statistics on breast cancer. One of the facts he discovered was that the incidence of breast cancer in Kenya was far lower than it was in the United States. In fact, in 1978, the chances of a woman getting breast cancer in Kenya were 82 times lower than in the U.S. Dr. Esselstyn was even more surprised by the numbers he discovered for some other types of cancer.
In the entire nation of Japan in 1958, how many autopsy-proven deaths were there from cancer of the prostate? 18. 18 in the entire nation. That, to me, was about the most mind-boggling public health figure that I think I'd ever encountered.
In the same year, the U.S. population was only about twice the size of Japan's, yet the number of prostate cancer deaths exceeded 14,000. Dr. Esselstyn also discovered that in the early 1970s, the risk for heart disease in rural China was 12 times lower than it was in the U.S. And in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, heart disease was rarely encountered. The link he noted between all the areas he studied was simple.
Virtually, the Western diet was non-existent. They had no animal products. They had no dairy, no meat.
The results were consistent. nutrients from animal foods promoted cancer growth, while nutrients from plant foods decreased cancer growth. Yet Campbell hadn't identified a specific biological mechanism that caused the effects he observed.
And it finally occurred to me that there was no such thing as the mechanism. What we were looking at was a symphony of mechanisms. We think that nutrition is attributed to individual nutrients, and that's the way it gets marketed, and that's the way the companies tell us, so forth. When in fact, nutrition, all of it working together to create this symphony, the hundreds of thousands of different kinds of chemicals in food, all kind of working together nicely. I mean, the complexity is total.
Heart disease, as far as I'm concerned, is an absolutely toothless paper tiger that need never, ever exist. And if it does exist, it need never, ever progress.
It turns out there's a successful movement of sustainable animal alternative food producers based right here in California, funded by big names like Bill Gates and Biz Stone.
When you imagine all those egg-laying hens eating all that soy and all that corn, you have an energy conversion ratio at about 38:1. Whereas alternatively, you can find plants, and you can grow those plants, and you can convert those plants into food. And the energy conversion ratio for the plants that we're using to replace the eggs is about 2:1, compared to 38:1 for eggs. So our explicit goal is to have the maximum amount of impact by creating this new model that makes the global egg industry entirely obsolete.
We're making the Omega products and proving that we can make better tasting food that's great for you, and it takes 1/20th of the land and resources that dairy do.
If I could tell you that you could have the fiber structure of meat, the satiating bite of meat, the protein, and all the nutritional benefits of meat without actually having animal protein itself, and by doing that you could address climate change, you could address the human health epidemics that we're seeing, you could address animal welfare, and you could address natural resource conservation, would you make the change?
To feed a person on an all plant-based vegan diet for a year requires just 1/6 of an acre of land. To feed that same person on a vegetarian diet that includes eggs and dairy requires 3 times as much land. To feed an average U.S. citizen's high-consumption diet of meat, dairy, and eggs requires 18 times as much land. This is because you can produce 37,000 pounds of vegetables on 1.5 acres, but only 375 pounds of meat on that same plot of land. I also learned the comparison doesn't end with land use. A vegan diet produces half as much CO2 as an American omnivore, uses 1/11th the amount of fossil fuels, 1/13th the amount of water, and an 18th of the amount of land. After adding this all up, I realized I had the choice every single day to save over 1,100 gallons of water, 45 pounds of grain, 30 square feet of forested land, the equivalent of 20 pounds of CO2, and one animal's life every single day.
Do you realize that 75% of Americans consider themselves to be environmentalists? You don't think we couldn't solve this problem in a heartbeat? I'll tell you what, all we would need is for the environmentalists to live what they profess, and we'd be on a new course in the world.
When you take the animal out, well, you also take the greenhouse gas issue out, and you take the food safety issues out, and you take some of the other externalities related to food scarcity out. But one thing that's amazing is, I think you put our values back in. You put values like compassion and integrity and kindness, values that are natural to human beings. You put that in. You build that back into the story of our food.
Renewable energy infrastructure, such as building solar and wind generators all over our country to reduce climate change, I mean, that's a pretty good idea, but it's projected to take at least 20 years and at least minimally $18 trillion to develop. So we don't really have 20 years, and we really don't have $18 trillion to develop these. So another solution to climate change, we could stop eating animals, and it could be done today. It doesn't have to take 20 years, and it certainly doesn't have to take $18 trillion because it costs nothing.